The morning mist still clung to the Shenandoah Valley on October 19, 1864. Confederate cavalry, lean and hardened, surged forward, confident in the familiar rhythm of pursuit. They had woken before dawn, shattered the Union lines, and now, as they closed in on the retreating Yankees, another easy victory seemed assured. But then, the sound began. Not the ragged crackle of muskets they knew, but a sustained, deafening roar, unlike anything they had ever heard on an American battlefield. A wall of lead, impossible to comprehend, tore through their ranks. Horses screamed, men crumpled. The familiar landscape blurred into a storm of unyielding steel, and suddenly the hunt became something else entirely. In the brutal fourth year of the American Civil War, a silent revolution had begun. It was a change forged not in grand strategies or desperate charges, but in the cold, unforgiving steel of a new technology, a shift that would shatter long-held doctrines of combat and redefine what it meant to fight on horseback. Before we dive deeper into this pivotal moment, let us know in the comments, where are you watching us from today? From Hidden Files. This is the revelation of Cedar Creek. The morning of October 19, 1864, found the Shenandoah Valley engulfed in a dense, chilling mist, clinging to the rolling hills and obscuring visibility beyond a few yards. For the veteran cavalrymen of the Confederate forces, this meteorological phenomenon was not a hindrance, but an unexpected ally, perfectly cloaking their movements as they had executed a devastating pre-dawn assault. Under the direct command of General Jubal Early, these hardened soldiers had unleashed a textbook surprise attack on the unsuspecting Union 8 Corps, catching them completely unprepared in their encampments near Cedar Creek. The initial hours of daylight had unfolded as a decisive Confederate triumph, scattering the Federal lines and driving them in disarray along the pike that led to Winchester. A palpable sense of exhilaration, born from successful surprise and the momentum of pursuit, ran through the Southern ranks. Mounted on their lean but resilient horses, animals that bore the scars of 4 years of war, often gaunt from chronic forage shortages but still possessing an indomitable spirit, the Confederate riders gripped their Enfield muskets and an assortment of Colt and other percussion revolvers. These were the very weapons that had proven their worth across dozens of engagements, from the rapid flanking maneuvers of the Peninsula Campaign to the brutal clashes at Brandy Station and Gettysburg. They were weapons of intimate familiarity, extensions of the men themselves, instruments of survival and victory. Many of these riders were grizzled veterans, having served under the legendary J.E.B. Stuart before his untimely death, and now under commanders like Wade Hampton and Thomas Rosser, whose brigades formed the spearhead of the pursuit. They were masters of this contested territory, intimately familiar with every twist of the valley, every hidden copse, and every ford of its numerous creeks. This intimate knowledge, honed through years of campaigning, fostered a deep-seated confidence that often bordered on arrogance. As they pressed their advantage, a current of confident mockery ran through their ranks. They derided the Yankee farmers from the north, mere mercenaries. In their view, hastily recruited and poorly trained who barely knew how to ride, let alone fight, and who would, according to Confederate wisdom forged in countless skirmishes, invariably break and flee at the first determined volley. They galloped forward, anticipating an easy, almost inevitable victory, utterly unaware that the very nature of cavalry warfare in America was poised on the brink of a fundamental and brutal transformation. The American Civil War, now deep into its brutal fourth year, had long since shed any romantic notions that had characterized its inception in April 1861. What began with optimistic predictions of a swift resolution had devolved into an industrial-scale carnage, a conflict devouring men and resources at an unprecedented rate, leaving an indelible scar across the nascent nation. By the spring of 1864, Ulysses S. Grant, recently promoted to lieutenant general and appointed general-in-chief of all Union armies, had meticulously orchestrated a new coordinated strategy of total war. His unwavering aim was to systematically crush the Confederacy through simultaneous, relentless pressure across multiple fronts, recognizing that victory would come through attrition and the destruction of the South's capacity to wage war. The Shenandoah Valley, a geographical artery running through western Virginia, assumed paramount strategic importance within Grant's grand design. Renowned as the Confederacy's breadbasket, its fertile fields supplied critical provisions to Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Furthermore, the valley served as a natural invasion route for Confederate forces to strike north towards Washington, D.C., or into Pennsylvania. Consequently, Major General Philip Sheridan, a short, combative Irish-American officer known for his aggressive leadership and uncompromising will, received explicit and chilling orders from Grant: systematically destroy the valley's agricultural capacity, burn it out, as the command was informally understood, and simultaneously eliminate the Confederate forces operating within its confines. This was total war in its rawest form, a concept largely unprecedented in American military history, where civilian infrastructure and the very means of sustenance became legitimate targets alongside enemy military assets. Sheridan, a leader of relentless energy, embraced this directive with ruthless efficiency, transforming the valley into a scorched earth. Throughout the preceding 3 years of conflict, cavalry had consistently been regarded as the elite arm of any army. They served as the commander's vital eyes, providing crucial reconnaissance and intelligence on enemy movements. They functioned as protective screens, guarding flanks and rearward movements, and when expertly handled, could deliver a devastating hammer blow, disrupting enemy formations or exploiting breakthroughs. However, a foundational limitation persisted, deeply ingrained in military doctrine and technology. Traditional cavalry relied overwhelmingly on single-shot firearms. A typical Confederate cavalryman, for example, might carry either a Springfield or Enfield musket. These muzzle-loading weapons required a laborious multi-step reloading process, biting a paper cartridge, pouring powder down the barrel, inserting the bullet, and then ramming it home with a long rod. In the hands of a seasoned marksman fighting dismounted, such a weapon might achieve a theoretical rate of fire of perhaps 3 accurate shots per minute. However, in the chaotic, dynamic environment of mounted combat, with a horse jostling and terrain constantly shifting, this rate dropped drastically, often to a single, imprecise shot before a cumbersome reload. The Colt and Remington percussion revolvers, while offering 6 rapid shots, required individual percussion caps and loose powder for each chamber, making mounted reloading under pressure a desperate affair. Established military doctrine was clear and had been for centuries. Cavalry typically fought dismounted when directly engaging formed infantry. They leveraged their horses for swift strategic mobility, rapidly moving to a threatened flank or exploiting an opportunity, but dismounted to maximize the accuracy and effectiveness of their muskets, essentially fighting as highly mobile infantry. Mounted charges were reserved for critical, often desperate moments, typically against an already demoralized, disorganized, or retreating enemy, where the psychological shock and sheer momentum of the charge could shatter wavering lines. Against a disciplined, unbroken formation, a mounted charge was suicidal. This traditional approach, rooted in centuries of European warfare and adapted to the American wilderness, would soon face an unprecedented challenge. The Confederate riders, confident in their established tactics, their intimate knowledge of the terrain, and the perceived superiority of their horsemanship, were about to confront a technological and tactical reality that neither their training nor their conventional weaponry could adequately address. Their shared experience of easy victories had, in essence, fostered an illusion of invincibility, blinding them to the silent, profound transformation that was already reshaping the art of war. While Confederate cavalry thundered across the Shenandoah in confident pursuit, clinging to the tactical doctrines of a bygone era, a different kind of revolution had been quietly brewing. This transformation was not born on the battlefield, but in the workshop, brought forth by the relentless vision of an individual whose insights would fundamentally alter the calculus of war. Christopher Minor Spencer, a 31-year-old inventor from Manchester, Connecticut, was precisely the kind of pragmatic mechanical genius that defined American innovation in the 19th century. His journey began not in academic halls, but as an apprentice mechanic, honing his skills at a young age within the burgeoning industrial landscape of New England. He worked for a time at Colt's Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company, an experience that immersed him in the intricacies of firearm design and mass production. It was there, amidst the rhythmic clang of machinery and the smell of oil and burnt powder, that Spencer conceived of a weapon that would shatter the prevailing limitations of military small arms. His vision culminated in the Spencer repeating carbine, an invention for which he secured a patent in 1860, a year before the outbreak of the Civil War. The Spencer repeating carbine was not merely an incremental improvement. It represented a quantum leap in firearm technology. At its core was a tubular magazine, ingeniously housed within the buttstock of the weapon, capable of holding 7 metallic cartridges. This design eliminated the laborious, time-consuming process of muzzle loading each shot. Instead, a soldier simply operated a lever beneath the receiver, which ejected the spent casing, cycled a fresh cartridge from the magazine into the breech, and recocked the hammer. The speed of this operation was unprecedented. While a conventional muzzle-loading musket could achieve at best 3 shots per minute in the hands of a skilled infantryman, a competent soldier armed with a Spencer could easily discharge all 7 rounds in mere seconds. With preloaded magazine tubes carried in pouches, a reload itself took only a matter of seconds, allowing for a continuous volume of fire far exceeding anything seen before. In the hands of a trained operator, a Spencer carbine could deliver between 14 and 20 shots per minute, a rate 5 to 7 times greater than the standard-issue rifle musket. Beyond its rapid rate of fire, the Spencer's ammunition system was equally revolutionary. It utilized .52 caliber metallic cartridges. Unlike the paper cartridges used in muzzle loaders, which were susceptible to moisture and often required a soldier to bite off the end to expose the powder, Spencer's metallic rounds were self-contained, waterproof, and inherently more reliable. This meant consistent ignition in all weather conditions, a critical advantage in the often squalid and unforgiving environments of wartime campaigns. The metallic cartridge design also greatly simplified the loading process, making it possible for mounted cavalrymen to reload and fire effectively from horseback, a feat virtually impossible with traditional single-shot firearms. Despite the obvious tactical advantages offered by the Spencer, its path to widespread adoption was fraught with bureaucratic resistance. The entrenched military establishment, accustomed to decades of conventional arms, viewed such innovation with deep skepticism. James Wolfe Ripley, the aging 69 in 1863 and staunchly conservative chief of ordnance for the Union Army from 1861 to 1863, stood as a formidable barrier. Ripley, a veteran of the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War, adhered to a rigid, almost anachronistic philosophy regarding military expenditure and soldier discipline. He famously argued that issuing repeating weapons would encourage soldiers to waste ammunition, leading to unnecessary expenditure and a breakdown of controlled fire, a core tenet of military training at the time. His objections, rooted in an old-world view of limited resources and tactical control, effectively stifled the initial widespread procurement of Spencer carbines, even as the war escalated into a costly meat grinder. Spencer, a civilian inventor, found himself battling not against enemy forces, but against the inertia and skepticism of his own government's procurement system. He spent countless hours in Washington, presenting his carbine to committees, demonstrating its capabilities, and attempting to convince military officials that the future of warfare demanded a change. The turning point for the Spencer, and indeed for Spencer himself, arrived in the sweltering heat of August 1863. Through persistent lobbying and the intervention of sympathetic officers, Christopher Spencer secured an audience with President Abraham Lincoln himself. The demonstration was arranged on the manicured lawns behind the White House, a stark contrast to the muddy, blood-soaked battlefields, where its efficacy would ultimately be proven. Lincoln, ever the pragmatist and keenly interested in technological advancements that might shorten the war, greeted Spencer with an air of earnest curiosity. The president was known for his hands-on approach, often personally examining new inventions. Spencer presented the carbine. Lincoln, at 54 years old, picked up the weapon, familiarizing himself with its weight and balance. Spencer then loaded the tubular magazine with 7 metallic cartridges. With a few brief instructions, Lincoln began to fire. The crisp, rapid crack, 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 crack of the Spencer carbine echoed across the Executive Mansion grounds, a stark departure from the slow, deliberate rhythm of a musket volley. Lincoln, rather than handing the weapon back, repeatedly worked the lever, reloaded with a fresh tube from Spencer's pouch, and continued to fire at a target board placed some distance away. His face, usually etched with the burdens of leadership, showed a flicker of genuine delight and profound understanding. "Spencer," Lincoln reportedly stated, his eyes wide with a keen assessment of the weapon's potential, "you have given us a weapon that will shorten the war." He fired off several more volleys, impressed not just by the speed but by the simplicity of the mechanism. Lincoln's informal endorsement, a direct bypass of the rigid Ordnance Department bureaucracy, proved pivotal. While General Ripley remained steadfast in his objections until his retirement later that year, the president's personal approval provided the crucial impetus. It signaled to field commanders and more progressive elements within the military that the Spencer carbine was not merely a novelty, but a strategic asset. Orders, initially small and often through private funding by individual regiments or states, began to trickle in. Spencer, a man of unwavering determination, committed himself to ramping up production. He established his own manufacturing facilities in Boston, working tirelessly against wartime shortages of materials and skilled labor to produce the revolutionary carbines. The initial contracts, however modest, allowed Spencer to prove that mass production of such a sophisticated weapon was feasible. This gradual adoption, often initiated by the very soldiers who would wield them, set the stage for the Spencer repeating carbine to slowly, inexorably, make its way into the hands of Union forces, profoundly altering the capabilities of the individual soldier and preparing the Union Army for a new, more lethal era of combat. The pre-dawn Confederate assault at Cedar Creek on October 19, 1864, had plunged the Union 8th Corps into disarray, a chaotic retreat under the thick shroud of morning fog. Thousands of Federal soldiers, many still rousing from sleep, had been overrun, their camps captured, their artillery seized. The Union command, reeling from the surprise, struggled to establish any coherent defense. Confusion reigned as units fragmented, commanders shouted contradictory orders, and the relentless Confederate pressure threatened to transform a strategic setback into a catastrophic rout. By mid-morning, the situation for the Union appeared grim, verging on total defeat. Reports flowing back from the front lines painted a picture of an army in full flight, demoralized and broken. However, the commander of the Army of the Shenandoah, Major General Philip Sheridan, was not present at the initial breakthrough. Sheridan, a man of dynamic energy and unyielding determination, had been attending a conference in Winchester, some 20 miles north of the battlefield. As the distant, yet unmistakable roar of cannon fire began to penetrate the early morning quiet of Winchester, Sheridan immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Without hesitation, he mounted his horse, Rienzi, and commenced what would become one of the most legendary rides in American military history, Sheridan's Ride. His ride back to the battlefield was a furious, almost mythical dash. Galloping down the valley pike, Sheridan passed by scores of retreating, dispirited Union soldiers, some still clutching their weapons, others simply in shock. He rallied them with impassioned shouts and the sheer force of his presence, urging them to turn back, to stand and fight. His powerful personality, a blend of Irish tenacity and West Point discipline, began to stem the tide of panic. By the time he reached the front lines around 10:30 a.m., he found his forces in retreat, certainly, but crucially, not entirely broken. While the 8th and 99th Corps had suffered heavily, cohesion had been reestablished in certain sectors, and the 60th Corps, though battered, held a defensive line. Upon assessing the chaotic scene, Sheridan, a commander who preferred audacious action to cautious defense, made a decision that would define the battle. Instead of consolidating and retreating further, he determined to counterattack. It was an incredibly risky gamble, given the Confederate momentum and the disarray of his own troops. But Sheridan saw an opportunity, a crucial element that had remained largely intact amidst the chaos: his cavalry. Central to Sheridan's plan was the division of cavalry commanded by Brigadier General James Harrison Wilson. At only 27 years old, Wilson was one of Ulysses S. Grant's young generals, a new breed of officer whose intellect and adaptability perfectly suited the evolving demands of modern warfare. A graduate of West Point and a trained engineer, Wilson possessed a keen understanding of both logistics and technology, a stark contrast to many of the more traditional cavalry commanders steeped in an older school of thought. He understood that the nature of mounted combat was changing, and he was determined to leverage any technological advantage available. Under Wilson's direct supervision, his cavalry division, approximately 5,000 strong, had undergone intensive and revolutionary training. Crucially, almost every trooper within his command was equipped with the Spencer repeating carbine. This was not a coincidence, but the result of Wilson's tireless advocacy and proactive acquisition efforts. He recognized the Spencer's potential immediately and ensured his division received a substantial allocation of the new weapons, often through channels that bypassed the ponderous federal ordnance bureaucracy. Furthermore, his men were mounted on well-fed horses, a critical advantage over their Confederate adversaries, whose animals, as a consequence of the South's dwindling resources, often suffered from chronic shortages of forage and were considerably less robust. Wilson had personally overseen the training of his brigades in the effective use of the Spencer carbines. He emphasized not merely the unprecedented rate of fire, but also tactics that were considered radical, even heretical, by conventional military standards. He had his units practice firing while mounted, a maneuver deemed wasteful and ineffective with single-shot weapons. The traditional doctrine dictated that cavalry dismounted to fight effectively, treating their horses as mere transport. Wilson, however, envisioned a new role: mobile dragoons, capable of delivering devastating volumes of fire from horseback while maintaining strategic and tactical mobility. His men were drilled relentlessly in the quick loading of fresh magazine tubes, the coordination of volleys, and the disciplined application of continuous fire. They learned to sweep across a field, unleashing a torrent of lead that would have been impossible just months prior. This training had instilled in his troopers a confidence in their new weapons that few other units possessed. As Sheridan rallied his infantry and began to reorganize a defensive line, he turned to Wilson. The decision was audacious. While the battered infantry reformed, Wilson's Spencer-armed cavalry would be moved to the flanks of the advancing Confederate army. This was not merely a defensive deployment, it was a strategic offensive maneuver. Sheridan intended for Wilson's division to act as a pivot, to disrupt the Confederate pursuit, and to provide the crucial momentum for a Union counterattack. The task was fraught with danger, demanding perfect execution and unwavering courage. But in Wilson, Sheridan recognized a commander who understood the power of his technologically superior force. The stage was set. The Confederate forces, exultant in their morning's triumph, believed they were simply sweeping away a defeated enemy. They had yet to fully grasp the depth of Union resolve, nor the quiet revolution in firepower that had taken root in Sheridan's command. As Wilson received his orders, his division, a mobile arsenal of 5,000 Spencer-armed troopers, began to shift, moving with deliberate speed towards the vulnerable Confederate flanks. The air crackled with anticipation, a silent tension before the storm. The battle for Cedar Creek, which had begun as a decisive Confederate victory, was about to enter its most critical and technologically transformative phase, a phase that would expose the fatal flaw in the South's reliance on outdated doctrine and inferior arms. The afternoon at Cedar Creek, once shrouded in the deceptive calm of morning fog, now bled into a landscape of brutal clarity under a shifting sky. By 4 o'clock, Major General Philip Sheridan, having rallied his infantry and meticulously reorganized his lines, gave the order for a general counterattack. The Union forces, though bruised, advanced with a renewed purpose. Crucially, Brigadier General James Harrison Wilson's cavalry division, positioned strategically on the Confederate flanks as ordered by Sheridan, was poised to deliver the decisive blow. The Confederate cavalry, buoyed by their stunning morning victory and still brimming with the confidence of past triumphs, observed the Union infantry advance. For General Jubal Early's men, this was the moment to once again unleash their proven tactics. Their cavalry, comprising seasoned veterans, many of whom had ridden with J.E.B. Stuart and Wade Hampton, prided themselves on their superior horsemanship and aggressive spirit. They had faced countless Union charges and always prevailed. To them, the Federal troops, though momentarily rallied by Sheridan's dramatic arrival, were still the Yankee farmers, they had driven before them just hours earlier. As the Union infantry pushed forward, elements of Confederate cavalry, particularly those on the exposed flanks, prepared for their traditional counter. Their bugles blared, cutting through the general din of battle, signaling the charge. Hundreds of horsemen, their sabers glinting in the pale afternoon light, spurred their lean but spirited mounts into a gallop. Dust rose in thick clouds behind them as they surged towards the Federal lines, a spectacle of ingrained courage and battlefield experience. Their plan was a classic, a swift, devastating mounted charge designed to break the Federal formation, exploit any weaknesses, and turn the tide of the counterattack back in their favor. They expected the familiar sparse crackle of musket fire, the brief, chaotic exchange before the enemy would fall back under the weight of their charge, giving them time to reload and press home the advantage. But what met them was a sound unlike anything that had ever echoed across an American battlefield. It was not the irregular, spaced pop-pop-pop of muzzle-loading muskets, nor the distant roar of cannon. Instead, a continuous, deafening crack-crack-crack-crack-crack-crack erupted from the Union lines, a sustained, guttural roar, like hailstones hammering relentlessly on a tin roof or a monstrous, unending rifle volley. It was the sound of concentrated repeating fire, and it was utterly devastating. Federal cavalry troopers, armed with their Spencer repeating carbines, unleashed a storm of metal upon the charging Confederates. Each man, with minimal training beyond the fundamentals of weapon operation, could discharge 7 metallic cartridges in mere seconds. The rapid lever action, the swift loading of fresh magazine tubes from their pouches, meant that the fusillade was virtually continuous. A single brigade of 1,000 Federal cavalrymen, theoretically, could put 7,000 rounds into the air in less than a minute, then reload in seconds, and do it again. The mathematical reality of this firepower was brutal and inescapable. The effect on the Confederate ranks was immediate and catastrophic. Horses, already thin and weary, screamed as bullets tore into their flesh, their legs buckling beneath them. Men, hardened veterans who had faced death countless times, tumbled from their saddles, some dead before they hit the ground, others screaming in agony as the metallic slugs ripped through bone and sinew. The disciplined lines of the charging cavalry dissolved into a chaotic, bloody mess. Troopers found themselves surrounded by falling comrades and thrashing horses, unable to understand the sheer volume of incoming fire. There was no pause, no lull in the Federal volley during which they could hope to close the distance, to reload their single-shot muskets, or even to aim their revolvers effectively. It was like charging into an invisible, impenetrable wall of lead, and that wall was relentlessly advancing. Brigadier General Thomas Rosser, a youthful 28-year-old commander and a former West Point cadet who had distinguished himself under Stuart, led his cavalry brigade, composed of many of Stuart's finest veterans. They attempted to hold a defensive position at Tumbling Run, a small tributary of Cedar Creek, hoping to stem the Union tide. Rosser's men dismounted, forming a skirmish line as was traditional, believing that fighting on foot would maximize their accuracy and allow them to hold their ground. But as Wilson's Spencer-armed cavalry swept around their flanks, the traditional rules of engagement evaporated. The Federal troopers, maintaining their mobility, advanced, firing from horseback, a tactical innovation that violated every established doctrine but worked with devastating efficiency. Rosser's veterans, renowned for their courage and tenacity, found themselves completely outmatched. The continuous, overwhelming volume of fire simply submerged them, tearing apart their formations, rendering their single-shot weapons obsolete in the face of such a deluge. Casualties mounted rapidly, and the brigade, despite its valor, was shattered, its survivors forced into a desperate, disorganized retreat. From his vantage point, General Jubal Early, the 48-year-old Confederate commander, watched with a growing sense of horror and bitter comprehension as his morning's triumph transformed into a catastrophic afternoon defeat. The very men who had swept through the Union camps at dawn were now being driven back, their lines dissolving under a deluge of fire they could neither match nor understand. Early, known for his harsh temperament and aggressive tactics, attempted to organize an orderly retreat. But the relentless pressure of Wilson's cavalry made such a maneuver impossible. The Federal troopers, no longer tethered to the slow pace of reloading, pursued with unyielding ferocity, cutting off escape routes, capturing supply wagons, and systematically destroying the cohesion of the Confederate forces. Wilson's cavalry, maintaining their unprecedented mobility, pressed their advantage relentlessly. They rode in multiple converging columns, pouring a continuous storm of lead into the retreating Confederate flanks and rear. The Federal troopers, trained by Wilson to maximize the Spencer's capabilities, found they did not need to dismount to fight effectively. This ability to advance while firing, to engage cavalry as mobile infantry, allowed them to maintain constant pressure, preventing the Confederates from reforming or establishing any stable defensive line. The sight of Federal cavalry sweeping across the fields, their carbines spitting fire like mobile artillery, was demoralizing in the extreme for the Southern soldiers. It stripped them of any hope of stemming the tide. By nightfall, Early's forces had suffered a catastrophic defeat. He lost more than 3,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured, along with all his artillery and the vast majority of his invaluable supply wagons. But more significant than the numbers, something fundamental had shifted. The aura of invincibility that had once surrounded Confederate cavalry, meticulously built through 3 years of brilliant campaigns under Stuart and other commanders, had been irrevocably shattered. It was broken not by superior horsemanship or more courageous charges from Federal cavalry, but by better technology. The grim reality of modern warfare, where technological advantage could decisively overcome traditional virtues of courage, skill, and knowledge of terrain, had been laid bare in the fields around Cedar Creek. The bitter comprehension settled over the Confederate leadership. Their bravest men and finest horses were no match for a weapon that could multiply Union firepower 7-fold. The age of traditional cavalry, with its single-shot firearms and emphasis on the saber, had effectively ended on this bloody afternoon. The brutal afternoon at Cedar Creek, where an unprecedented deluge of repeating fire shattered Confederate lines, irrevocably marked a turning point in the battle and, by extension, profoundly influenced the trajectory of the American Civil War itself. General Jubal Early's catastrophic defeat was more than a loss of men and material. It was a psychological and tactical blow that reverberated throughout the Confederacy. For the Union, the devastating efficacy of the Spencer repeating carbine, wielded by General James Harrison Wilson's cavalry, had introduced a new paradigm of combat. Cedar Creek became the crucible where traditional mounted warfare met its technological superior, heralding the definitive ascent of the Spencer as a symbol of modern, industrial warfare. The pattern of destruction witnessed in the Shenandoah Valley was not an isolated incident. In the ensuing weeks and months, the Spencer's lethal efficiency was replicated across multiple theaters, consistently tilting the balance of power in favor of Union cavalry. A prime example occurred during the decisive Nashville campaign in December 1864. Here, Major General James Wilson, now commanding the Union Cavalry Corps in the Western Theater, deployed his Spencer armed troopers against Lieutenant General Nathan Bedford Forrest. Forrest, a self-taught tactical genius and one of the Confederacy's most feared cavalry commanders, faced an insurmountable challenge. His forces, numerically inferior and armed predominantly with single-shot weapons, were systematically outmatched and driven back. Forrest's brilliant maneuvers, which once guaranteed success, faltered against an enemy that could unleash a continuous storm of lead from horseback. The zenith of Wilson's Spencer-led campaigns came in April 1865, as the Confederacy teetered on the brink of collapse. Wilson led the largest and most destructive cavalry operation of the war, a force of over 13,000 troopers, almost entirely equipped with Spencer carbines, through Alabama and Georgia. This sweeping raid devastated the remaining industrial heartland of the Confederacy, destroying crucial factories, foundries, and railroads. At the Battle of Selma, Alabama, Forrest, with fewer than 5,000 men and an even greater disparity in arms, attempted a desperate stand. His defensive lines, though bravely held, were simply overwhelmed by the sustained, relentless firepower of Wilson's mobile arsenal. Confederate cavalry attempting traditional charges or defensive stands against Spencer-armed Federal cavalry repeatedly discovered that valor and superior horsemanship were no longer sufficient against an enemy capable of delivering a volume of fire many times greater than their own. Statistical analysis of these engagements starkly revealed the extent of this technological revolution. In the early years of the war, cavalry clashes between roughly equally numbered forces resulted in relatively low and balanced casualties. By 1864-1865, however, in engagements where Spencer-armed Federal cavalry confronted conventionally armed Confederate cavalry, the casualty rates became dramatically asymmetrical. At Cedar Creek, Wilson's cavalry suffered fewer than 200 casualties, while inflicting over 1,000 on Confederate cavalry alone. Similarly, at Selma, Federal losses were less than 300 compared to over 2,700 Confederates. The overwhelming margin of victory, the unprecedented casualty ratios, signaled a profound shift in military effectiveness. The Spencer Company produced over 200,000 carbines and rifles during the war, with Federal contracts absorbing the vast majority. The Union government acquired more than 15 million metallic cartridges for the Spencers, a testament to the immense volume of fire the weapon enabled, and a crucial recognition by the military establishment that modern warfare demanded overwhelming firepower. This advanced technology also fundamentally transformed the strategic nature of cavalry operations. Traditionally, cavalry was vulnerable when isolated from infantry support, its limited firepower making it susceptible to well-positioned infantry. But Spencer-armed cavalry changed this calculation. In 1864-1865, Federal cavalry conducted deep, independent operations far into Confederate territory, movements previously considered too risky. The capacity to deliver a volume of fire comparable to dismounted infantry, while maintaining strategic mobility, meant these forces could effectively engage not only enemy cavalry, but also isolated infantry units. Wilson's raid through Alabama and Georgia, covering over 500 miles, destroyed countless industrial and railway installations and defeated every opposing force, all because his command possessed the concentrated firepower to fight as mobile infantry when necessary, coupled with the strategic mobility to avoid being fixed by superior forces. For the struggling Confederacy, this technological disparity arrived too late to be corrected. The South, with its limited industrial capacity and a naval blockade strangling imports, simply could not produce repeating firearms on any meaningful scale. Some Confederate units captured Spencers and used them when ammunition was available, underscoring the weapon's perceived superiority. By March 1865, with the Confederacy in its final throes, leaders like General Joseph Johnston, commanding in the Carolinas, publicly acknowledged the grim reality. He observed that his forces were as inferior in arms as in numbers, and that Federal cavalry in particular had become practically irresistible in the war's final months. Their traditional advantages, courage, tactical genius, intimate knowledge of the land, had been rendered insufficient. The legacy of the Spencer Revolution extended far beyond Appomattox. The fundamental lesson learned on those bloody fields, that firepower, multiplied through technology, could decisively overcome traditional advantages in training, tactics, or terrain, would resonate for decades. The post-Civil War Indian Wars saw the U.S. Army, now fully convinced of repeating weapons' value, equip its frontier forces with Spencers and later Winchester repeaters. At the Battle of Beecher Island in 1868, 50 scouts armed with Spencers repelled hundreds of Cheyenne and Sioux warriors, again, technology overcoming numbers and skill. The subsequent development of machine guns, higher capacity repeating rifles, and eventually automatic weapons all traced their conceptual lineage back to that basic revelation from 1864: more bullets, fired faster, wins. The Spencer Company was eventually eclipsed by more modern designs, but the carbine designed by Christopher Minor Spencer had proven the concept and irrevocably changed military thinking. On that foggy afternoon at Cedar Creek, the era of traditional saber-wielding single-shot cavalry effectively ended. The Civil War was the last major conflict where such cavalry played a significant role. Future conflicts would see cavalry transformed into mounted infantry, using horses for mobility but fighting primarily dismounted with repeating and eventually automatic firearms. The initial mockery of Yankee farmers had proven tragically misguided. Those farmers, though perhaps not natural horsemen, understood tools and machines. When given a tool that multiplied their effectiveness sevenfold, they wielded it with devastating effect. The Civil War began as a war of courage and Napoleonic tactics. It concluded as a war of logistics and industrial firepower. The Spencer carbine, more than almost any other individual weapon, symbolized this profound transformation, the death of military romanticism and the brutal birth of modern industrial warfare, where technological advantage, thanks to Christopher Minor Spencer's vision, became the dominant force on the battlefield. Conclusion. The mists that once obscured Cedar Creek lifted to reveal a battlefield irrevocably altered, not merely by the passage of armies, but by the relentless march of technological progress. The sound that echoed across the Shenandoah Valley that autumn afternoon, a continuous terrifying roar of repeating fire, marked the end of an era. Confederate gallantry and mastery of terrain, once the pillars of Southern cavalry prowess, proved futile against the overwhelming mathematics of the Spencer carbine. From that moment forward, the narrative of warfare began its inexorable shift from individual martial virtue to industrial might, from the saber's flash to the relentless hail of metallic projectiles. The fate of armies, and indeed of nations, now hinged not solely on courage or tactical genius, but on the ability to arm one's soldiers with the most efficient instruments of death. The legacy of Cedar Creek endures as a stark reminder. Innovation, however incremental, often holds the key to unforeseen transformations, reshaping not only the battlefield, but the very fabric of human conflict. It questions whether inherent skill can ever truly withstand the relentless force of technological superiority, and compels us to consider the often unseen architects of change, like Christopher Minor Spencer, whose quiet genius forged the future in a crucible of conflict. What, in your opinion, defines the true turning point in any war? The spirit of its soldiers, or the ingenuity of its engineers? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If the echoes of history and the hidden forces that shape our world captivate you, delve deeper into another untold story with our video on Suggest a relevant past video title here, e.g., The Enigma of the Ironclad Duel. And if the unraveling of these historical files illuminates the darker corners of our past, consider lending your support by liking this video and subscribing to Hidden Files for more untold narratives.